Take this sheet. Okay. Aaron, you can sit there. You can't stand. But okay. Now we're going to call the Senate committee to order, election law and municipal affairs. And our first order of business is an amendment to House Bill 1626. And we'll ask Dan Maguire to come up first. If you'd introduce yourself, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Dan Maguire. I represent the town of Epsom. I'm the prime sponsor of this bill and just was unable to be here for the first public hearing, so I thought I'd come and both to support this amendment. It seems perfectly reasonable to me that if you read the law about how veterinarians are being reimbursed by this program, they perform three different functions. Two of them are being reimbursed 100%, and one is being reimbursed 80%, which just seems weird. So this makes it so that they're properly reimbursed for all three functions. So it makes sense. And in the unlikely event you have questions about other parts of the bill, I'm happy to answer.
All right. Questions? Seeing none, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I am Sean Jasper, Commissioner of the Department of Agriculture, Markets and Food, and I appreciate you taking this amendment up as I had requested it during the original hearing. I'm sorry that we did not pick up on this earlier, but this is very important. As I testified at the time, we have fewer and fewer veterinarians participating in the program, and we believe some of it, but not all of it, is because of the fee. This is a fee that is set by the state veterinarian, so it's not one veterinarian charges one rate and another another. This is in other parts of the law, the average is established by the veterinarian, and so instead of just getting the 80% of that, they'll get 100, and we have no fear that this is going to negatively impact the fund.
Questions from the senators? Seeing none, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Is there anyone else that did not sign up and now has changed their mind and wants to speak on this? Seeing none, we will close the public hearing, and as soon as we're ready, we'll open the next one on 1091. Okay, just let me look through this for a second. Okay. And who's here to introduce the bill? Come on forward. And introduce yourself and the bill. There you are. I saw you on the list now.
Yeah, I'm way down at the list. I'm Representative Connie Lane. I represent Merrimack District 16, which is Ward 2 here in Concord. And I'm the prime sponsor of the bill. I have additional sponsors Representative Barry, who's in the room, Representative Quayle, Representative Muirhead, and Representative Ward. I think I got them all. And the bill is a result of a subcommittee that was formed by Chairman Barry. We worked over the summer and into the fall and drafted this bill in working sessions up until, I think, maybe the day before crossover, and incorporated comments provided by the Secretary of State, the Attorney General's office, and the members of our committee. The bill is substantially similar to the bill that was passed by the Senate, SB 534. And I do have some handouts that I prepared. Do you want me to? Okay. So I have 10. I didn't know some of them. So the first handout is a PDF of 1091. Technology is not my strong point, but I went through and tried to mark where the definitions may be a little bit different from SB 534, where we put in provisions that perhaps aren't in SB 534, and then noted some of the comments that I had gotten from the Secretary of State's office as well. So my effort was, since you were probably more familiar with SB 534, was to compare the two bills and bring those to your attention. The second one is a red line of the statute that shows the changes that 1091 makes. Our committee found that very helpful. I will try to do the same thing for SB 534, but frankly ran out of time. So, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Like I said, it's substantially similar. There are some differences. We also incorporated SB 530 into our bill since it dealt with campaign financing, and that's the bill that the Senate passed about legibility, the font size, requiring online. You're filing campaign financing reports online. One difference in our bill is that we require that all statements, that all statements that you make to the Secretary of State be online.
The extra, put them over on the,
Okay. Okay. Thank you. I'm gonna keep one. So one of the differences that for the next election cycle, which would run from after the election in 2024, that election cycle, the candidates for governor, the candidates for state senate, and for executive council would have to file online unless they get a waiver from the Secretary of State's office, and the standards for the waiver are set out in the statute. Then for the next cycle, the 400 of us, as you say, on the other side of the wall, would then come into, and we would have to file as well as well as the county commissioners and everybody else. The idea being to get everybody to file online under the new system. That's the one. I think those are the two major changes that are the differences between the two bills. I'm happy to answer any questions.
questions for the representative? Senator?
I have one, and I'm looking for it because I had looked at the draft online. I thought one of the other differences was the requirement for party committees to have to register every cycle. Is that part of this version?
I think so.
May I ask why you would do that? Since they're, go ahead, just.
I think we just considered it a political committee, and we're trying to have the same rules for every political committee. If it's not, I mean, we certainly not, I'm not going to stand on the hill for that one, but I don't think there was any reason except we were trying to treat all political committees the same, which was one of the comments that we had gotten both from the AG's office and the Secretary of State's office, was to treat everybody pretty much the same, have the same deadlines. If there's a rationale for not doing it, you know, I'm not.
Okay, we can talk about it offline. as I said, was just trying to look for it in here, but
Yeah.
I'm sure we'll have lots of conversation. Thank you.
Okay.
Additional questions? Seeing none, thank you very much, Representative.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Linda Bundy.
Good morning, Chairman Gray and members of the Election Law and Municipal Affairs Committee. My name is Linda Bundy, and I live in Antrim. I support HB 1091. During the spring and summer of 2023, I attended most of the work sessions of the House Election Law Subcommittee on Campaign Finance. It was gratifying to observe congenial, collaborative, bipartisan discussion and work on laws that can be confusing and inconsistent for candidates to follow. The committee worked with the offices of the New Hampshire Secretary of State and Attorney General, using their suggestions to help guide revisions to make the campaign finance laws simpler and more clear. This bill is the culmination of the committee's efforts. I believe it is a significant improvement in the law. I ask that you vote ought to pass on HB 1091. Thank you.
Questions from the senators? Seeing none, thank you very much. Olivia Zinc.
Good morning, members of the committee. My name is Olivia Zinc. I'm a voter in Franklin, New Hampshire, and the executive director of Open Democracy, a nonpartisan nonprofit. Voters have the absolute need to know who's spending money to influence elections, and campaign finance laws are here to protect the political process from corruption. This bill is a labor of love. I call it many meetings that have happened. I have a couple of suggestions for, so I'm just going to start on page 1, line 16. They removed the thresholds. There used to be a $1,000 threshold for reporting, a $2,500 threshold, and a $5,000, depending on what type of political committee it is. There is still a threshold for reporting, but I do think that adding that threshold back into line 16 is important.
That was line 16 on which?
Page, well, the first, page 1. Also on page 1, line 24, political advertisements mean any paid communication, and I think it should say expenditure for, because paid communication and expenditures have slightly different definitions. So I think it would be important to add the word expenditure to link that definition back. On page 2, in the definition,
How many of these do you have, Olivia?
a couple.
Because probably easier to do in an email and not worry about which line and page they're on right now, but just speak to them in generalities and we can go through the pages after.
Okay, page 2, line 10. I think it's important in the definition of expenditure to put promote or success of a party or candidate in that first thing and not just in B, because right now it just applies to B, but it should apply to the whole definition. And then on page 3, line 8, independent expenditure, a person is missing from this definition. It used to have a person or a political committee, and I think it would be important to add the word person back into that definition. And I'm happy to email the others. The other thing I just want to mention is on page 7, the courts have stricken down measure, so we can't limit measure. So it would be good on line 6 to remove the word measure. And then in line 27, it says he statement, and I think it should say the statement. So that's just a typo.
And put those in an email and send them to the committee. You also, if they're applicable to the Senate bill that was passed, you probably should put reference in there because you never know when this committee is going to start from.
Okay. So just want to, final enclosure, I want to thank Representative Lang for building the common ground to redraft the campaign finance. Thank the Secretary of State's office and the AG's office for providing memos and insight on where campaign finance was confusing and where it could be cleared up. And so I do support this bill. Although it's not perfect, maybe an amendment can be offered to make it just a little more clarifications. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Questions from the senators? Seeing none, thank you very much. Deputy Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Erin Hennessy, Deputy Secretary of State. Like some of the other speakers said, I want to thank both this committee and the House Committee for all the time they spent to try and redraft Chapter 664. It's a very complicated and wordy chapter for candidates to follow. And I think a lot of the changes that the House did in this bill and the Senate did in its bill will help to make the process much more easy to follow for users of the system and of the new online campaign finance system that just rolled out, but also for people who look for transparency in our system in New Hampshire. There are a few things that I think the House did great in their version of campaign finance bill. For example, they expanded some definitions. The candidate definition and the communication definition, I think, are great. There are some things that I would change in their version of the bill. They took out political advocacy organization as a specified version of a political committee. I think that's going to be confusing for those organizations thinking they may not now have to use our campaign finance system here in New Hampshire. Also, the term, they put the word paid into political advertising. And I'm sure that you guys are aware New Hampshire has a lot of great resourceful people who don't always have to pay for certain things. They can copy things on their home printers if they're a member of a committee and go out and distribute them door to door with political advertising on them that they didn't necessarily pay for, but that should require disclosure. So I'd like to remove that term paid from that line. And I'm happy to send the committee all of my suggested small edits that might be there.
I do have a question. Even if you Xerox something or print it on your own paper, it's still you paid for it. So I don't necessarily think that we need to take that out. Comment?
I think the purpose of the House Committee in attempting to change this chapter was to make things easier to use and to be transparent. And I think by putting in the term paid when it didn't used to be in there signifies that that's a change in our law. And now you only have to do it if you actually put out specific money to do that certain thing. And I think it's going to be confusing and going to create a lot of people calling our office wondering why something's not disclosed on that they just received on their door.
Well, I'm sure that you and I and the rest of the committee will have many conversations before this gets out of committee. Questions from the other senators? Seeing none, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Is there anybody that wanted to testify that didn't? Just make sure we don't have anybody outside. They're online. There was 5 in support and 1 opposed. And there was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 people who also signed up in support, but did not wish to speak. Nobody out there? Okay, so with that, we will close public hearing on 1091, and as soon as we're ready, we'll open the next one. He talked to me this morning. Okay, are you ready? Okay, we will open the public hearing on House Bill 1150. And who's here to introduce the bill? Okay. Representative.
Thank you. My name is Representative Ross Berry. I represent Hillsborough 39, Manchester Ward 689. I'm here to introduce House Bill 1150 relative to advertising rates for political advertising. So this comes at, you may be familiar with the case where I think the publisher out of Londonderry, I want to say, basically was not following the law, depending, he said, she said sort of stuff. I'm sure they would disagree on that it's one way or the other. But at the end of the day, political advertising on newspapers is treated differently than everything else for a reason that seems to escape me. So a political advertisement in a newspaper the disclaimer still has to run on the actual ad. So you still say paid for by X, but so-and-so committee, address, all that sort of stuff. But newspapers have to add paid advertisement at the top of it. And they're the only medium that we require that of. We don't require that of any other medium. So we took that out. We just got rid of it entirely. And we also got rid of, there was a requirement that they had to file with the Secretary of State their rates for advertising. This was to make sure that they were in compliance with not charging differential rates between candidates. So, I charge Senator Susie $1, but I charge Senator Gray $5. Obviously, it's the same product, so it amounts to an unequal, effectively a campaign contribution by charging Senator Susie less. I don't think newspapers are doing that. We left the part of the law in that says they can't do it. We just got rid of you have to report your rates to the Secretary of State because it was not, believe it is not being universally followed. And I would highlight that our newspapers, somebody who represents Ward 6, as Senator Susie does with the union leader, newspapers are, their physical newspaper is contracting, it is not expanding. So I feel like we can kind of lay off of them a little bit and still have the spirit of the law intact. So long story short, disclaimer still has to run, rates still have to be the same, but we're going to put them in line with the rest of advertising. And we're going to get rid of, they are the only ones who have to report to the state their rates. So we don't require that of any other medium. So we just made them like everyone else.
Questions from the senators? Seeing none, thank you very much. Bob Perry. Would you check and see if he's outside? Mr. Perry. Hit your mic.
Yeah, thank you. We're on 1150, correct? Thank you. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, I speak in opposition to HB 1150. This bill would repeal requirements that political advertising be disclosed as such in a prescribed manner and timeframe when published in the format set out in existing law, but stricken in their entirety. It also repeals disclosure of the scheduling of rate filings, thus also eliminates public inspection for compliance of that scheduling. The title has changed to reflect the repeals and leaves in place the language that advertising rates are to be equal among candidates, parties, and cause. It's important that readers understand the distinctions between advertising and journalism, for example. I rely on disclosure to know the difference when it is initially not apparent. Without such disclosure in the age of artificial intelligence, deep fake videos, and hotly contested elections, the repeal of current law is certain to add to the uncertainty of understanding of the value of what we are hearing or seeing with our own eyes. I conclude, therefore, that current law is needed now more than ever. Thank you.
Questions from the senators? Seeing none, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Open democracy. Catherine, looks like Lens.
Yeah, of course. Well, good morning. For the record, my name is Catherine Langell. I am a 20-year-old voter from Concord and a student at St. Anselm College, serving as Open Democracy Action's Public Policy Fellow for the semester. I'm in opposition to this bill, and my message kind of echoes what Bob Perry said and what I'm sure you'll hear from others. For the case of brevity, I'm going to go and provide an example. I'm Gen Z and very happy to be so. And we experience a lot of influencers trying to sell us things. And when influencers post something that they are paid for, they must disclose that. So this bill strikes crucial language and effectively eliminates the requirement for a paid political advertisement to disclose their main purpose. And this change affects a voter's right to know and when and how they may be influenced. I'm happy to try and take questions. If I can't answer it, I will direct it to someone else.
Questions? All right, thank you very
Awesome.
much.
Thank you.
And looks like Brendan McQuade, maybe NHPA.
Thank you. Yes, Brendan McQuade. I'm the president and publisher of the New Hampshire Union Leader, as well as the president of the New Hampshire Press Association. So the case that Representative Berry was referring to was a woman named Deb Paul, who is a publisher in Londonderry, and she used to publish 3 papers, but after all of her legal fees, she only has 1 paper left because the Attorney General decided that she was responsible for the disclosures that are on political advertising under the campaign finance laws in New Hampshire. So he charged her and she was convicted of that and has to pay over $1,000 in fines for not using the magic words that say paid political advertisement at the top. This currently only applies to newspapers and billboards. Why we should be singled out when this is a world of digital media makes 0 sense. And I would urge you to pass this bill so the news media, which is already under great threat from a number of different factors, doesn't have to deal with the threat of being prosecuted and arrested for not using the correct language, even though the way this is written, it still maintains the paid for by language. So every ad that's going to be a paid ad is going to have the disclaimer at the bottom. It's just not going to say paid political advertising at the top or bottom, which is the way the law currently reads. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Questions from senators? Seeing none, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Deputy Secretary? Questions for Deputy Secretary? Seeing none, thank you very much. Check outside to see if there's anybody who wanted to speak. The online signups, there was 0 in support, 6 opposed. Okay, and since there's nobody outside, we will close public hearing on 11:50. And as soon as we're ready, we'll open the next one. Am I on time, ahead of time? Where am I?
5 minutes behind, but pretty close.
5 minutes behind.
I think that's on time instead of.
All right.
There's another sheet.
There's another sheet over
There
there?
is, but people might still want to find it.
Okay.
Yeah, I missed it.
Is everybody here for the second bill?
1569?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Um, need to check that other sheet to see if there's any state reps that have signed up, because I need to take them first. So just grab one of the other pieces of paper if there's anybody there, and okay. Representative, come on forward. And Trish, you ready? Okay.
Thank you, Senator Gray and members of the committee. My name is Bob Lynn. I'm a state rep from Wyndham, Rockingham District 17, and I'm the prime sponsor of House Bill 1569. I appear here in support of it. Essentially, what this bill is designed to do is to basically say, if you want to vote, you have to provide proof of certain things: citizenship, domicile, age, and identity. And that there really should be no exceptions to that. That essentially is what the bill is designed to do. It's designed to eliminate the affidavit procedure that exists under current law for a number of things. One of the things that and I'm happy to take any questions people may have. One of the things that the opponents of various forms of voter identification legislation always say is, well, there's no evidence of voter fraud. What's the problem? Why do we need to? Why do we have to have this legislation? But if you stop and think about the basis of that, and I have to say, candidly, do I think there's a huge issue of voter fraud in New Hampshire? No, I don't. I'm not, because I think if there was, we would know it. But the idea that it's sort of de minimis, that there really is no voter fraud or almost no voter fraud, I think that is the answer to that is we really don't know the answer to that question, because voter fraud is very difficult to identify and prove. And one of the things that I think is a real irony in this area is one of the reasons that we don't have, a huge concern of voter fraud is that the vast, vast majority of voters in our state do the very things that the opponents of this bill say you shouldn't be able to require everybody to do. They do. They have provided all the documentation. They've registered to vote early, and they have provided all of the things that they need to satisfy the requirements of this bill. And the people who are saying, well, there's really no problem with voter fraud are and therefore you don't have to do this. The reason they can say that is that the vast majority of people do comply. Imagine if the situation were that the vast majority of people in New Hampshire registered to vote by providing affidavits. That's all they did. They didn't provide any documentation. They just said, trust me, my name is Bob Lynn and I live in Wyndham and I've lived here since 1996 and I should be able to vote. and here's my affidavit. I don't have to provide you any documentation. What would we say if almost everybody did that? And we had this, a huge stack of affidavits, but that was it, no documentation. I think that then we would all say, wow, can we really, is it really true that our voter system that there's no problem with it? I think we would have very real concerns about that. And this is designed to make sure that we don't have those concerns. And I'm happy to take questions.
Questions? Senator Burke?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Does this subject us to the motor voter requirements?
No, I don't believe it does. I've heard that a suggestion to that effect, but I don't see why we still this bill does not in any way eliminate same day voting or same day voter registration, which, as I understand it, is the linchpin of our exemption under the motor voter. And so, I don't think it does. If somebody has a different view, I'm not, listen to that, but I guess I'd like to know exactly the basis upon which that claim is made, because I don't think it does.
Thank you.
Senator Susie?
I actually have a follow-up to that question. So I was a member of the House in the early 1990s when Congress passed motor voter.
Right.
And New Hampshire, working with then Secretary of State Gardner, and I believe it was Representative Gary Gilmore, came up with same-day registration. And my understanding is that our exemption is predicated on every voter being able to register. So don't you think there is a possibility there are some voters who would not be able to register if this were to pass?
Well, no. I guess what I would say is no, in the sense that the things that people need to do to register are within their ability to do. So, if somebody didn't have, let's just take an ID. If somebody didn't have an identification, but they could get an identification, I don't think and they simply hadn't done it, I don't think that would be a basis for them to say, well, I couldn't register. Of course you couldn't register. You just had to do, you just had to do the things, get the documentation that you needed to register.
Could I ask another question, if I
Absolutely,
may?
Senator.
There was also provision in the statute that allows for the moderator to identify someone who regularly comes to vote.
Right.
In the absence of them providing a physical
Right.
piece of documentation. We've heard testimony here before. I think it was the Derry town moderator who said there was a gentleman, early 90s, gave up his driver's license like years and years ago. So his son regularly brings him in. Does not have documentation,
Right.
but has voted there before. Why was that provision eliminated in this bill?
Well, I'm not sure that there is a provision to that that says something like that in existing law, but if I could be wrong, but I don't think so. But I guess wouldn't the circumstance that you've just described, I would think that you say the moderator knows that this person has voted there for years, so I would think that the moderator in that circumstance could say, this person, I know this person, and that would constitute the reasonable evidence on which the person could make the determination.
Well, I think the part I'm looking at, if I may follow up, Representative Lynn, is on page 9. If you start about line 5, the language is crossed out where it says when an election official uses personal recognizance as a substitute for required documentation under this section, they have to print on the margin that they've done so, and that seems to be stricken from the law, so that's why I asked the question.
Oh, you know what? But I think that there is.
Just to help you out, Representative, that's one of the things that you and I did talk about.
Right.
He did not know that was out. I have suggested putting it back in along with a few other changes that he and I have talked about that I'll go into when we I get my chance to ask you questions.
You know what, I think that that language is in somewhere else in the bill. I think, I don't know, it might have been taken out there, but I do believe that there's a provision that allows the moderator to say, basically, I know this person, or an election official to say that. I think that's in there.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Representative Lynn, you and I talked about the bill.
Right.
Certainly, I was uncomfortable with the section in the bill. If you're looking at page 3, lines basically 14 or 13, 14 through 16, that only allows the courts until the polls close.
Right.
I had suggested putting that in and say that the courts could come back between then and the close the period for people to file a recount. And you didn't express an objection to that.
Right. No. I think, I think it's true that the way the bill is currently worded, it is true that if somebody were to come in late in the day on election day, and there was for example, let's say the voter was challenged and the moderator ruled against the voter. Well, the bill, the way it's currently worded, says that the voter, if he or she is dissatisfied with the moderator's ruling, can go immediately to Superior Court, which has to make every effort to make a decision before the polls close. But if this were to happen at 6 o'clock on a Tuesday and the polls close at 7, the practical reality, I'd have to concede, would be it would be pretty hard for the court to make a decision. So I don't. Your suggested change, Senator, to give a period, to make that a period of 7 days or something, would be. I don't have any problem with that. The only thing I would say is, remember that what that is going to mean then is that the person is going to have a sort of a ballot that gets queued up in some way, so that if the person doesn't provide the documentation, or the Superior Court affirms the moderator's ruling, the vote can be
an affidavit ballot.
the ballot can be removed from the count.
One of the other things that we talked about was asking the Secretary of State, the AG's office, and probably the DMV also, to stand up a group to assist supervisors in doing some of the investigation that we would do from an affidavit on election day. Comment on that?
Yeah, right. I know. I don't have any problem with that. I mean, I think that the goal that I want to achieve by this legislation, and I hope it's one that everybody could agree on, is you should have to provide the documentation or your vote shouldn't count. And I think that is something I hope everybody could agree on. To the extent, one of the other things that we talked about, Senator, and I would be perfectly supportive of this, is if there is some suggestion that, some people, because of poverty or whatever, are not able to provide the documentation that is required, then personally, I would say let's have a provision that if somebody can, files an affidavit saying that they're, or provides the evidence that they are indigent, that the state would provide some level of assistance to help them get whatever the documentation is that they need. I mean, I think we already have that with regard to non-voter identification, non-driver identification. Maybe that should be expanded, and I have no problem with that at all. It's certainly not my desire to prevent people who are indigent from voting. I have no desire to do that, and if there's something we can do in that regard, I'm perfectly supportive of it.
And the last thing that you and I talked about that I I want to go into today is on page 7 and 8. You talk about residence, and I want to change that to domicile to be consistent with other parts of the law.
7.
So page 7, line 7, and page 8, line 13, and where it talks about seeking to vote does not reside and, okay, is not domiciled. And then on the other one, does not reside again.
No,
and is not
domicile, that's fine. Domicile, I think, should be the proper standard.
And as I understand it, well, all we're really doing is defining when that documentation needs to be supplied, and that it should be supplied during the vote, or when the person is requesting to vote. in
Right,
this.
right. It should be supplied either when the person is requesting to vote, if the person is, registering on election day, or hopefully, as with most people, provided when they register to vote, which is before election day.
Okay, any additional questions? Thank you, Representative.
Thank you.
Representative Lane.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For the record, I'm Representative Connie Lane. I'm from Merrimack District 16, which is Ward 2 in Concord. I am here to oppose this bill for several reasons, many of which I'm sure will be repeated by others who are more expert than I. First of all, as Representative Lynn indicated, there is no evidence of voter fraud by the use of affidavits, which we've been doing, I think, as Senator Susie indicated, since the 1990s. The second reason is that it allows someone to challenge a voter without any real evidence, and they can challenge ironically, by an affidavit. And as Representative Lynn indicated, as the bill is written, there's really no real due process provided if you are doing that, if you vote probably after 3 o'clock in the afternoon, because the courts close at 4. And in many parts of New Hampshire, trying to get to a superior court can take over an hour to 2 hours, particularly up in the North Country. Another reason is that citizenship is not required in most states to vote, again, because under the motor voter law, they don't require it, and in federal, they don't. And the reason is because it's very expensive if you don't have documentation. It can take over 6 months to get it and costs over $500 to get it. And many people don't have that kind of money to spend, and most people don't plan ahead 6 to 7 months to vote. So that would be another reason. Another reason I oppose it is because, and I think we should research this, because it is my understanding that affidavits were part of the deal to exempt us from motor voter. And we should explore that with the Secretary of State. If that is the case, then I don't think we should be eliminating these affidavits until we're very sure that it's not going to upset our apple cart with how we vote in New Hampshire. I honestly don't know that that's the case. And the next item is that the effective date of this bill is 60 days after it's passed, which means that it would be effective for 2024. In my experience, that would be an inadequate amount of time for the Secretary of State to train all the clerks and the supervisors of the court. And when we make these kind of changes, we usually do it for the next following election, not for the one that's immediately coming up. So while I'm opposed to this bill, if you are going to pass something similar to it, I would ask that you at least defer it until the next election to give the clerks and the supervisors at the checklist time to learn how to do everything. It's going to be a brand new process. And the other thing I wanted to bring up is that if someone lies about being a citizen on an affidavit, it's highly unlikely they will ever become a citizen, because that will be an affidavit under oath, and they will not be able to complete their citizenship documentation. I'm not sure that someone would risk that. And I think other speakers will address this point as well. And that's really all I have to say on this point.
All right, you didn't address any of the questions I asked Representative Lynn about the changes, making the process for challenging, at least if it's election on Tuesday, that would give them till noontime on Friday. If we tie it to the last day to request a recount, or standing up this group that would allow anyone documentation, because if they've registered before, they don't have to prove citizenship, etc. You didn't comment on any of those?
Well, I'm not sure that I mean, I guess I want to understand what the proposal is. They would do a provisional vote, is that, or they would have?
We would have to stand up a procedure such as the affidavit ballot. Now it may be called ballot pending judicial review, or or something. But
So, and I think except with respect to citizenship, which I do not think should be required to be proven, I don't think, I am not sure that a provisional ballot is constitutional either. So I would not be in favor of that.
okay, additional questions? Seeing none, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Representative Barry.
This is the old yin and yang here. My name is Representative Ross Berry. I represent Hillsborough 39, Manchester Ward 6, 8, and 9, Chair of the Election Law Committee. I'll answer any questions you guys have about it. I just want to say we're talking about voter ID at its core. Voter ID is very popular, not just in New Hampshire, but across the country. I think the last time it was polled in New Hampshire, voter ID was at 72% approval, including 50% of registered Democrats. So voter ID, which is what this is, people want to show ID. One of the biggest flaws in SB 3 was that it asked people to show their ID, it didn't require them to show their ID. And because of that, most Granite Staters already think that something like this is the law. They actually already think it's kind of like this, that if you don't have your ID, you're not going to vote. I would refute the notion that there's no voter fraud in the state of New Hampshire. There's 9 pending cases with the Department of Justice right now. Senator Gray and myself receive a packet, I think every 6 months, right, Senator Gray? We get a packet from the Department of Justice about open and recently closed investigations involving election law. So there's 9 open for double voting right now. In fact, the idea that the affidavit has never been used to abuse voting is just patently false. In 2016, a Democrat ballot inspector voted in West Lebanon, then went out to their car, put on a blonde wig, and came back in and registered to vote as a fictitious woman. The only reason, by the way, that vote was counted. So the only reason that we found out about that later was because the individual then applied for a driver's license as the fictitious woman, and the state police were actually the ones that caught it. So that vote counted. There were 2 votes counted using an affidavit ballot in West Lebanon, which was, by the way, hilarious that I had somebody from West Lebanon tell me this wasn't a problem. So it's when it comes to voter fraud, I agree with Representative Lynn. Is there massive amounts of voter fraud? No, of course not. But to say there is none or that we should ignore the problem is also a fallacy. One of the biggest forms of voter suppression is people not having faith in the outcome of an election. If people do not believe that their vote is being counted, or they believe that their vote is being washed out by someone who should not be having their vote counted, they are less likely to participate in the process. That is voter suppression. A system that allows for anyone to show up on election day with nothing, register to vote, and be handed a ballot that is then counted is an inherently flawed system that we can debate to the extent that it's being abused, but no one can debate the notion that it is wide open for abuse. So Granite Staters want this. It was overwhelmingly received positively in the media, which actually surprised even myself. I thought we were going to take some incoming flack for it. Actually took very little, if any. Why? Because I go back to my original point. Voter ID is very popular. Granted, staters want voter ID. Are there going to be issues that we're going to have to work through? Of course. I'm skeptical of the idea that this will trigger motor voter. The NVRA passed in 1993. And I would remind people suing that if they try to go that route and they do somehow trigger it, which I don't think that they would, that would open us up to getting rid of same-day registration. So I am skeptical that litigants would be going down that path knowing what would inevitably happen if they did prevail in court. So that being said, I'm happy to answer any questions, but that is my general statement about voter ID. I believe we should have elections that people can believe in. I believe if you have an electoral process that people can believe in, more people will participate.
Questions from the senators? Seeing none, thank you very much. There's a representative, Reed, Ellen Reed, that signed up, didn't request one way or the other? From Rockingham 10? Okay. Again, she didn't indicate, so I'm trying to give her the benefit of the doubt. All right, next I have a Richard Spence, and right underneath you I have an Susan Spence. You didn't indicate whether you wanted to speak or not, Susan? Okay, I'll check you off as a not. Okay, Richard.
There we go. Okay. My name is Richard Spence. I'm the supervisor of the checklist for Dover's Ward 3. Based on my experiences as supervisor, I oppose House Bill 1569, which claims to address voter fraud by eliminating affidavits. It would require prospective voters to physically present a document proving their citizenship before they can register without exceptions. As a supervisor, though, my job is to facilitate voting, and affidavits are useful tools to make it happen. They're common use during voter registration. It's already been mentioned. You have to have a photo ID, proof of citizenship, proof of being over 18, and a proof of New Hampshire ward domicile. Then, if you don't have it, affidavits are required. Now, affidavits very clearly spell out the penalties for falsity. Under RSA 659, Section 34, 1 year in prison and a fine up to $2,000. Fraudulently registering to vote or voting carries a fine up to $5,000. Presently, there are several affidavits in common use. You're probably familiar with them: the domicile affidavit, the qualified voter affidavit. This covers identity, citizenship, and age. The challenge voter affidavit, when the voter comes with no picture ID to show. And there's also one that's not used very often. It's the affidavit of religious exemption, which is for those who object to having their photographs taken. My experience has been that affidavits are checked. They're checked out, or they have been checked out in Dover anyway, by the clerical staff, by the Secretary of State's Department, and if necessary, the Attorney General. And I cite one case. The verification process was extensively reviewed during the Senate SB 3 lawsuit. And what happened is, out of 1,669 uses of the affidavit of domicile, which is the subject of the case, the Attorney General found only one case of fraud. So there's, as was mentioned before, there's virtually no evidence of voter fraud in New Hampshire, as evidenced by the Senate Bill 3 case, and the attempt to eliminate the affidavit of domicile was even declared unconstitutional by the courts. So with these protections, it's no wonder that Governor Sununu, the Secretary of State Scanlon, and the Voting Public's UNH survey show confidence in the New Hampshire voting process. The proposed legislation is simply not needed. Voter fraud in New Hampshire is slight to non-existent. Not only would the legislation be redundant, but its unintended consequences would be to disenfranchise voters by eliminating the possibility of helping prospective voters with informational gaps. Who are we talking about?
If you look at the various elections, depending on the type of election, depending on the voter turnout, you're talking of 0.35 to 0.5%. You're, in terms of how many people that involves, you're really talking about between 2,000 and 4,000 people who would otherwise be qualified from exercising the most sacred of American political activities, the right to vote. My experience registering potential voters points to a quarter of the registrants needing affidavits in some form. So House Bill 1569 would penalize those who have moved, been unknowingly removed from voter rolls, or did not bring the required documents to the polling place. In addition, the provisions of the bill would allow private citizens to challenge potential voters on election day, which to my mind could well make a circus of the new registration process. A minor point, perhaps, is that no funding is provided in the bill. How much will it cost the taxpayer? And how much will it cost potentially if it runs into the same problems that Senate Bill 3 did? To my mind, this is something that sounds a little bit like the saying attributed to the American sage Yogi Berra. It's deja vu all over again. In summary, the bill sets up unnecessary barriers to voting. This is a solution searching for a problem and will not enhance fraud prevention in our state. It's not needed to safeguard our elections and will cause additional problems for supervisors of the checklist, particularly if it takes effect 60 days after the passage between the upcoming primary and the general election. This bill should not be passed and be inexpedient to legislate. Thank you for your attention.
Questions from the senators? Seeing none, thank you very much. Andrew Harmon?
And I'm sorry, which chair has the microphone in front of it?
Just the one you've got your hand on.
Is this?
You're all set. Just start talking.
And it's on.
Okay. Thank you. My name is Andrew Harmon. I'm a resident of New Hampton, New Hampshire. And I'm here to speak in opposition to House Bill 1569. I was a resident of Keene, New Hampshire for 10 years, but during the once in a generation pandemic, I had to move back to my old hometown in New Hampton to help my mother because her mother was experiencing Parkinson's dementia to an extreme degree. And when I had to move back, I wanted to vote in my municipal warrant, which I already experienced barriers as a person who is legally blind. I cannot read print and have not been able to read print for about 15 years. I went to vote. I thought that even though my non-drivers was a little out of print, I thought I would still be able to vote. And I was able to do so only because I was able to sign an affidavit with the help of the moderators. The reason I had to do, and despite that, I still had to get documentation from my house because as I'm now passing around the copy of my birth certificate that was notarized, they could not recognize due to it not looking correct to them. I also have my new birth certificate so you can see in comparison the issue. So if House Bill 1569 had been in place, I would not have been able to vote. And I vote in every election that I can get to since I was able to do so when I turned 18. I have also lived in that town for most of my life. The moderators know me by name and on site, and yet still they would have had to turn me away. I would have had to go to the nearest Superior Court, which I don't even know where that is because of how remote where I live is. I also probably would not have had the money at the time for the Superior Court as I was in between jobs at the time. So I would highly, highly recommend this inexpedient to legislate for those reasons, as well as and many other reasons that will be covered by other people later today. If people have questions, I'm happy to take a couple, but I also want to give time for other people to speak.
Senator.
Thank you, Chairman Gray, and thank you, Andrew, for being here today. Just hopefully a couple simple questions. I noticed that your birth certificate originates from California. How long did it take you to obtain a new copy of your birth certificate?
Several weeks. And that was after having to try and find a way to get a hold of somebody, because the main phone number for the office that handles it, nobody answered. I got sent to a voicemail, which wouldn't even let me leave a recording.
And I assume you had to do that at some cost as well.
Correct.
Okay, thank you, Andrew.
Any other questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Louise
Thank you for
Spencer.
being here.
And thank you for having me.
Oh.
Hi, Chairman Gray. Thank you for having me. Thank you, committee members. My name is Louise Spencer. I'm from Concord, New Hampshire, and I also am with the Kent Street Coalition, which is an all-volunteer grassroots advocacy organization. I'm speaking today both on my own behalf and on behalf of the Kent Street Coalition in opposing this bill, HB 1569. So nationally, voter fraud is rare, and here in New Hampshire, it is vanishingly rare. The Heritage Foundation's voter fraud database records just 21 instances of verified voting irregularities in the Granite State since 2006. By far, the majority of these cases involve duplicate voting by people who own properties in New Hampshire and then in other states. Interestingly, as it pertains to this bill, those people would have documentation that they own both of those properties. The rest of the cases involve a smattering of other irregularities, and none of which were related to citizenship. It's doubtful that HB 1569, if in place, would have prevented any of these instances of voter misconduct. Now, we've heard from those supporting this bill that voter fraud is very difficult to identify and to prove, and the argument that it must be much greater than the verified cases. And of course, we all take voter fraud very seriously. We don't want to see it. It needs to be prosecuted if it occurs. It's a serious crime. But how do we address the issue of this idea that there's more, extensively more voter fraud than what we're able to identify? There are several ways we can assess these claims. We can look to our elected officials who are on the ground. That includes the Secretary of State, election officials, and even our own governor, who have attested to the integrity of New Hampshire's elections. We can also look to court analysis. Here in New Hampshire, in SB 3, it was found that there was very little voter fraud, just incidental instances of voter fraud. And nationally, in 2020, there were over 60 cases that alleged voter fraud that the courts found had no merit, and those cases were rejected. We can also look to meta-analyses, and the Hoover Institute and the Center for Revitalizing American Institutions did a statistical analysis of the 2020 elections, and again, found no extensive voter fraud. So the fact that this bill is based on that premise makes it problematic. What we do know, however, is that if this bill were in fact passed, we know that individuals will be prevented from voting. A substantial number of individuals will be prevented from voting. The supervisor of the checklist in Derry, Judy Strakalatis, I think has submitted testimony, but she said that she's the chair of the supervisors of the checklist. 70% of registrants use an affidavit of some sort, and 2/3 of people use an affidavit to show citizenship. Only the people who are naturalized citizens, those are the only affidavits that get reported to the state in regard to citizenship. But if someone is natural born U.S. citizen and uses an affidavit, that does not show up in any of the records. But this is based on her experience. I also want to share from one of our members of Kent Street her concerns of how this bill could potentially impact her. Lillian Carter from Deering writes, I am a naturalized U.S. citizen. My birth certificate is not in English and is under my maiden name. My naturalization papers are also under my maiden name. I do have a U.S. passport, but all these documents are stored in a safe deposit box at a bank that is located over an hour away from my house. If I go to vote after 4 p.m. and for some reason have been dropped from the voter rolls inadvertently, which we do know happens routinely, when I go to vote, this bill would effectively prevent me from voting. I would not be able to get to the bank before it closes at 5, and therefore I would be barred from voting. I became a U.S. citizen expressly so that I could vote. So this is the real world consequences of this bill. This bill can affect any voter. If you show up at the polls and you've forgotten your ID, you will be turned away. That can happen to any one of us. And we know it will happen. We know that people get busy and show up. These are people who are constitutionally entitled to vote. We should be encouraging them to participate in democracy. And this bill would disenfranchise people, both those trying to register to vote and those trying to obtain a ballot. So I urge you to oppose HB 1569. Thank you.
Questions from senators? Senator Perkins Coker.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Louise, for being here. So just a couple of questions. I think your testimony speaks to, and we certainly have evidence from the Secretary of State that there have been virtually no cases of voter fraud, and those that have been investigated have found they've involved mishaps, not fraud. And so, as you say, this bill could have the potential to have much more harm than good. Are you aware of the experiment that Kansas conducted in requiring proof of citizenship? And are you aware that there were potentially over 30,000 disenfranchised voters in 2 years, which was approximately 12% of voter registrations during that time?
I have heard that, yes. I think there are people here who can speak more directly to that, but I am aware that happened. I also would express deep concern that we are coming off of the 10-year purge and that many voters only vote in presidential elections. So they will be showing up assuming that they're still on the voter rolls here, and then only to find that they have been dropped from the rolls and would not be coming prepared with a slew of documentation, to be prepared to re-register to vote.
Thank you, Louise. Follow up, if I may, Chair. Thank you. And under our current law, aren't there protections if there is a voter that's challenged? For example, under our current law, there are procedural protections for that voter to make sure they can still vote. They execute a challenged voter affidavit, but then there's also notice and opportunity for the voter to be heard. There's an opportunity for the voter to introduce witnesses or evidence to support their right to vote. There's opportunity for neutral fact finder, which the supervisor, the checklist, or moderator there can be evidence presented if they're conflicted or biased. And there's also a meaningful right of judicial review under existing law. Wouldn't these protections be lacking if we passed HB 1569?
As far as I understand this bill, yes. And I do find it highly ironic that somebody can challenge a person's right to vote using an affidavit, but that person cannot themselves attest to their qualifications to vote using an affidavit. And I would also mention that an affidavit is documentary proof. It's a document that is signed that carries severe legal consequences, particularly for, as someone mentioned, for a non-citizen to sign that document. But for any person signing and swearing to a document that turns out not to be true is a real thing. This is not a flimsy piece of paper, an affidavit. It has meaning. So, I just think the law works very well as we already have it, and that this is going to create a host of problems, both seen and unforeseen. I'm very concerned about the extra work for election workers and the delays that this will cause as people are kind of fumbling around trying to decide whether, oh, do you have the documentation? Don't you? Were you registered before? Weren't you? Let us look it up in the database. Oh, the database is down. Oh, it's going to create a nightmare at the polls. So, in my opinion. And I will just premise, I will say that I have done voter protection for many, many years, where I am often at the polls. I'm often, in fact, in Windham. And it is common for people to show up thinking that they are registered to vote, only to find out that they have been inadvertently dropped from the rolls, or that they didn't receive their 30-day notice. It is, and luckily people now have the opportunity to go to the supervisor's desk and re-register, but under this bill, they most likely wouldn't have the documentation needed to do that. So,
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Additional questions? Thank you very much.
thanks so much.
Next on the list, Linda Bundy.
Hello again, Chairman Gray, members of Election Law, Municipal Affairs. My name is Linda Bundy. I'm from Antrim. I'm speaking in opposition to HB 1569. I'm fortunate to have lived in the same small town for over 40 years, where I'm also a registered voter. The only time I've come close to having difficulty proving my identity was when I applied for a real ID driver's license and was told that I didn't qualify because the name on my birth certificate was different from my current name. I was shocked to learn that I didn't qualify, and obtaining the necessary document took weeks. This bill would impact eligible voters in a variety of circumstances different from mine, who go to the polls on election day, planning to register to vote and discover that it's not possible. Likely to be affected are young people, new voters, people who move frequently, victims of fire, flood, or other disasters, and those who are experiencing housing insecurity. No longer could they sign an affidavit, vote, and have time to locate their documents. Difficult life circumstances should not cause an eligible voter to be disenfranchised. I've spoken with 2 of the 3 supervisors of the checklist in my town, and they believe that voter affidavits should be preserved. When I inquired at the office of the New Hampshire Secretary of State regarding affidavits used in voter registration, the reply stated that affidavits have been used since 1979. Through this long history, there has been practically no voter fraud. New Hampshire elections are safe and secure. Governor Sununu commented in reference to this bill on March 15th. To quote him, "I think our system works really well right now," Sununu said. "We have a very high voter turnout. If you want to register day of, you can. I'm not looking to make any changes." This bill seeks to address a problem that doesn't exist. I ask that you vote an expedient to legislate on this bill, and I thank you for your time.
Questions from the senators? Seeing none, thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Bob Perry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Bob Perry, Town of Stratford. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, I speak in opposition to HB 1569. Given the gravity of election 24, and I'll be 2 minutes, 10 seconds. Given the gravity of election 24, I anticipate there will be a significant number of Granite Staters who will want to use same-day registration. More than 2,000 voters used affidavits to vote in the 22 midterms. Those affidavits are eliminated. Then some will discover they have been purged from the voter rolls, unaware they would need to have in their possession the documentation required by this bill to prove citizenship. They will be told they cannot, without presentation of their birth certificate, they cannot vote without presentation of their birth certificate, passport, naturalization papers, or other reasonable proof of citizenship. Perhaps impossible to accomplish if late in the day, perhaps impossible any time of day. Whatever we may think about a voter being purged under the 10-year statute and deciding to partake of their civic responsibility this fall, our Constitution does not make exceptions for voters who are less than organized or unreliable or become the victim of a purge for any other reason. The word reasonable is found in law profusely. It is a subjective standard. Acceptance of reasonable documentation will vary among moderators throughout the state, which betrays uniformity. This bill represents a major departure from what Granite Staters have come to understand about requirements for voting. It repeals and replaces or amends 14 current statutes, yet there is no requirement for voter education. And it might not matter, since its implementation may be so close to the election, there will not be sufficient time to adequately educate voters anyway. These changes will come as a shock to the disenfranchised and may well turn into serious problems for election workers at the front lines of voter ire. Lastly, I suggest there is no amendment that can improve this bill, because there is no amendment that can restore the multiple rights this bill repeals. I urge ITL.
Questions from the senators? Seeing none, thank you very much, Mr. Perry.
Thank you.
Sue Nastasi?
Thank you.
Okay. So, good morning, Senator Gray, and the Senate Elections Committee. I'm Sue Nastasi, a resident of Rollinsford and one of the supervisors of the checklist. House Bill 1569 should not continue past this committee. It eliminates voter identification exceptions by eliminating the use of sworn affidavits on Election Day. Of course, identification on Election Day is required, but not the elimination of any exceptions by the voter using a sworn affidavit. The following is my personal story as an example of the need for exceptions. I don't have my birth certificate. Beats me where it is, or most likely it's gone because I moved too much. The idea of plain requesting a duplicate should be basic routine. But I was born in Elizabeth, New Jersey, and named Eileen Spread in a hospital that doesn't exist anymore. By 4 months old, I was taken by New Jersey Family Services due to neglect by my birth mother. At 18 months, I was old. I was adopted. My name changed to Susan Stasi. From 1978 to 1995, I had the married name of Susan Russo, which changed back to Susan Stasi when divorced. Since 1969, I have kept my passport up to date that I must depend on. My efforts to obtain the birth certificate have failed with a response of no record or no response at all. At 73 years old, I shove ahead, supporting voting rights. Registering to vote on Election Day is known by Granite Staters and used often because town hall hours are not public friendly, except for, say, New Hampshire cities. The public wants to vote, can be forgetful to carry identification on Election Day. We all have busy lives. For those elected officials that support this bill, please consider your constituents. They are not being represented in a correct manner for you to support HB 1569. Everyone deserves the right to vote. New Hampshire does not want to be known for voter suppression, and especially during 2024 presidential election year. Thank you.
Questions from senators? Seeing none, thank you very much. Liz Tenderelli.
Thank you, Senator Gray, for this opportunity to speak. Liz Tenterelli, I live in Newbury. I'm president of the League of Women Voters. And as a nonpartisan organization whose mission is empowering voters, we work to explain voter registration and election procedures to the public. Now, until now, we've been able to say you have to be 18 or older, a citizen, and live in New Hampshire in order to register and vote. But this bill would change that. Instead of you have to be 18, a citizen, and live in New Hampshire, that would now be you have to have paperwork to prove you are 18, a citizen, and live in New Hampshire. Now, is this really the way we want to look at voting? Not that you have to be eligible, but that you have to hand over documentation that you're eligible because people don't trust you. It's not the way people want to think about voting. The sponsor of this bill, and I want to point out there is only one sponsor for this bill, would have that be the rule. But this committee and the Senate need not agree. You can acknowledge that not everyone lives the same kind of organized life that you do, that not all people have easy access to their own paperwork due to life circumstances. What we have always demanded is that voters be 18, a citizen, and live in the town in which they vote. To change this procedure is a way of telling some people you just can't vote. Now, I'm including in this testimony the story of a longtime New Hampshire resident and voter, the husband of a League of Women Voters member who asked me to deliver this. Bob Davies is 90. He lives at Heritage Heights in Concord, and before that, he lived in Bow. He votes. He's voted for years, but he does not have a birth certificate. He was adopted, and adoption records in New York State were closed until a few years ago. And last June, almost a year ago, he decided to get a birth certificate. He applied to the New York City Health Department, and after a few months' delay, they determined they couldn't issue his birth certificate because the adoption order had an error in his parents' address. So then he sent an application to the Surrogates Court in Brooklyn to amend the adoption order. That was sent last October, and Bob and his wife kept checking, and in January, officials said they were still looking. but the records dating back to 1934 were not digitized, necessitating hours of work. Finally, New York officials found the paperwork, and Bob is now waiting for the judge to sign the amended order, which will then have to go back to the health department so they can issue the birth certificate. Now, luckily, Bob Davies was not applying out of necessity. At age 90, he said everyone else in his family had a birth certificate. Maybe he'd like to have one now, too. And so he decided it was time. But when Bob first registered to vote many, many years ago, not having a birth certificate was not an issue, nor was it for me and many of you. He gave the date and place of birth, signed the forms. But had this bill been in effect, if Bob had been living in Massachusetts before moving to Concord, to the senior living facility, he would not have had a birth certificate to present. He would have been qualified, but denied the right to vote. Now, I know you'll hear other stories today, but you shouldn't have to. You need merely acknowledge that our law now requiring that voters be 18 citizens and residents has worked well and will continue to serve our elections. We don't need this bill. We don't want to deny the vote to some residents of New Hampshire on a whim. And I urge you to please vote inexpedient to legislate on this bill. Thank you.
Questions from the senators? Seeing none, thank you very much. Brendan Flaherty.
Well, good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Brendan Flaherty. I work with the DuPont Group, and I'm here today on behalf of Secure Democracy. We are registering their opposition to House Bill 1569, largely because it does away with the qualified voter affidavit that's currently provided for in RSA 65412. And SDUSA sees about 3 issues that stem from the removal of that affidavit. First, it exposes New Hampshire voters and taxpayers to the risk of costly litigation. There are 2 states that we know of, Arizona and Kansas, that are each facing about $2 million in litigation for passing similar bills. The second issue is that it jeopardizes our exemption from the National Voter Registration Act by effectively eliminating same-day voter registration. And since those measures put our exempt status at risk, it would likely mean that we might need to comply with motor voter laws, and that would come with about a $6.5 million price tag. And finally, SDUSA looks at these issues through a veterans lens as well. And SDUSA feels that this bill would be bad for children in military families. If anyone born abroad into a military family needs their consular documents reissued, it'll cost them $50 in about 2 to 4 months, which cannot be expedited. So those are the 3 quick issues that SDUSA has with 1569. Again, they're opposed, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Questions from the senators? The military families, I believe that they still require passports, right?
I'm not sure. I'd have to follow up. But
I think you should. All right, thank you
all
very
right,
much.
thank you.
Henry Clementowitz.
Thank you very much. My name is Henry Clementowicz. I'm a senior staff attorney at the ACLU of New Hampshire. I've been a voting rights litigator for about 10 years in New Hampshire, and have been counsel for an amicus in maybe the last 8 major pieces of voting rights litigation. We hear the proponents of this bill talk about how people support voter ID, but this is not a voter ID bill. When people say voter ID, what they think of is, pulling out your driver's license when you go to vote. But this bill requires so much more than just having a driver's license. This bill does away with all of the affidavits used to prove all of the qualifications, including citizenship. And I think it's worth putting a fine point on the fact that your driver's license, even a real ID, is not proof of American citizenship. The documents that are an American birth certificate, naturalization papers, or a passport. We've heard other speakers talk about how difficult it is or expensive it is to find some of those documents. It was told to me that something like 80% of American women change their name when they get married. And if your name on your birth certificate isn't your name, you're not going to be able to use just that birth certificate to prove citizenship. You're going to need a passport too, or naturalization papers, which you'll only get if you naturalize. The cost and difficulty of providing these documents is probably why the 10th Circuit in 2020 struck down a very similar law in Kansas requiring documentary proof of citizenship. That law was enjoined about 2 years after it was enacted, and so there was real data for the court to look at to see how many people were impacted. And what the trial court found was that something like 12% of registrants, when they went to go vote, were rejected because they did not have documentary proof of citizenship. And later, the state's handpicked litigation expert conceded at a deposition that 99% of those people were qualified and should have been allowed to vote. So there's a tremendous risk of a huge number of people who are registering just not having the documents that they need to do it, because it's not as simple as pulling out a driver's license. I think this would make New Hampshire the only state in the country to require documentary proof of citizenship. We've heard a little bit about how this could cause us to lose our NVRA exemption. Ironically, most of the litigation around documentary proof of citizenship is brought under the NVRA because the NVRA requires a uniform registration card, and attempts to require proof of citizenship have been ruled to be preempted by the NVRA. So there's an irony here that probably if this bill caused us to lose our exemption, it would then be in violation of the NVRA anyway. And as to Senator Murphy and Senator Soucy's discussion about that, so there's 4 states that are exempt from the NVRA. They're exempt because under 52 USC, a state which under a law that is effect continuously on or after August 1, 1994, or that was enacted on or prior to August 1, 1994, and by its terms is to come into effect upon the enactment of this chapter, so long as that law remains in effect, all voters in the state may register to vote at the polling place at the time of voting in a general election for federal office. So the real question is, people who don't have a birth certificate, right, or a passport, who can't register on the same day, is that still all voters? Well, we don't know a lot about this, what the statute means, because it's, to my knowledge, never been interpreted by a court. But I think there's a pretty good argument that we'd lose our exemption. And the important thing that this committee should know is once the exemption is gone, it never comes back, right? This is a big gamble that we'd be taking with the NVRA exemption, because it would cost, as the speaker said, $6 to $7 million. It would require the federal postcard. It would require registration at DMV. It would require registration at other state agencies. It would require third-party registration. It would require the uniform postcard application. There's a lot of things that would happen to dramatically rewrite New Hampshire election law irreversibly if we lost this exemption. A prior speaker made a point that they didn't think any litigants would bring this challenge because of the risk that it brings to same-day registration, and I'd say that they're forgetting about one big litigant, which is the United States Department of Justice Voting Rights Section, which is ultimately the one charged with making this determination before it goes to a court. So I don't know what the DOJ is going to do. I don't know what a court would do with it, but it's a pretty big gamble. I do think I know what a court would do with the documentary proof of citizenship piece, because we saw what happened with the 10th Circuit just 4 years ago. Just to touch on the voter challenges piece, I mean, I think others have pointed out the irony in allowing a challenge to go forward brought on the basis of an affidavit without allowing people to refute the very same accusations by affidavit. It seems to me that we're saying, well, I trust your word that someone else doesn't live here, but I don't trust their word that they do, even though the person who lives there actually has the base of knowledge. We know this is going to impact thousands of people. Over 1,000 people have used the various affidavits in the last 2 state general elections to prove at least one of their qualifications. I think those numbers are probably low, and that we'd see a much bigger issue. So I think that's all I have to say, except beyond, on the piece about the prevalence of voter fraud. The Attorney General's office has an investigator, a full-time attorney, a paralegal, just dedicated to election law. It's not like this is an uninvestigated area in New Hampshire. It is an investigation. I personally have seen search warrants that have been executed by the Attorney General's election law unit to figure out where people's cell phones were on the day of an election. They take this seriously to say that, well, it might be a problem, we don't know, but the only way we can disprove it is by potentially disenfranchising thousands of qualified voters. Risking lawsuits and risking our NVRA exemption seems to me to be an unwise policy choice. So with that, I'll conclude. I'm happy to take any questions.
Questions from the senators? Do you have the number? Oh, you had a question, Senator Susie? No, go ahead. I'll wait.
I just had one. When you were saying there were 4 states that are exempt from NVRA,
Yes.
correct, of which New Hampshire is one. And should we lose the exemption, you mentioned third-party registration. In other states, who would do third-party registration? What are they, entities, individuals?
Well, it doesn't have to be a state entity is a key point. Citizens can hold voter registration drives. In New Hampshire right now, only the supervisors of the checklist can actually put a person on the voter rolls. Town clerks can gather the information and give it to the supervisors of the checklist at town or city hall. Under the NVRA, it's a whole new world where just regular citizens can do that too.
Thank you.
The last time that I asked questions about the affidavits, they told me that there were still a number of affidavits where they could not identify the person after the election, and you have not spoken to that, which could change the number of people committing voter fraud considerably.
So I don't know what percentage of so there's different affidavits that are used. There's the qualified voter affidavit and there's the domicile affidavit and the challenge voter affidavit, and they're investigated through different processes set forth in statute. And I think the verification rate is different depending on the registration process. What they do is the first thing that happens is the Secretary of State reaches out to the local election officials to try to corroborate a person's domicile through publicly available records like tax records, dog licenses, marriage licenses, birth certificates. Those that can't get verified by the Secretary of State go to the Attorney General's office, where they and the New Hampshire State Police call local police departments, use investigative tools that are beyond my pay grade to maybe even know about. Literally have heard of state troopers driving to people's houses to verify their domicile. I don't know exactly how it works with citizenship because that's harder to do. And part of the problem, I think, that we're sort of all circling around is that there isn't a centralized database of American citizens in this country. There just isn't. So it's not like, well, maybe it would be easier if we could just go online, or the state police could just go online and type in a person's name and date of birth and figure out if they're a citizen or not. But that database, at least as far as I'm aware, does not exist, and certainly doesn't exist in New Hampshire law. So I don't know exactly what percentage of those affidavits are ultimately verified, but I do know that there's something like 2,000 affidavits that get submitted in an election, and like maybe one person who gets prosecuted and convicted of voter fraud. So I think that gives you a pretty good sense of like where the equities are when you balance them.
As an engineer, it doesn't tell me anything unless I know what that other number is. Thank you for your testimony. If there's any other questions, not. Iris, and it looks like an ALT something. Okay, come on up. Come on up.
Is it okay if Christina from AARP, who's also there, speaks with me at the same
Fine.
time? Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Christina Fitzpatrick. I am the state director for AARP New Hampshire, and I live in Bow. I am here to speak in opposition to HB 1569.
Have her introduce herself since you're up here on her dime.
And my name is Iris Altilio. I'm a resident of Pembroke. I am an AARP New Hampshire volunteer. I'm here also as an older adult, a voter, and a checklist supervisor.
So I'm going to speak more generally about AARP's approach, and then Iris is going to speak about her own experience.
Speak to the bill.
Yes. So AARP has a long history of involvement with voter education and voter engagement, providing information to voters about where candidates stand on the issues and what they need to be able to.
Speak to the bill.
So the AARP's position is that voting systems, processes, and regulations should be designed to maximize participation by people who are eligible to vote. And we believe that these changes proposed by the bill would impede voting by people who are qualified. Older adults would be affected by these changes and provisions in terms of having to provide a driver's license when they go to vote. It can be harder for them to get to and from the polls if they can't drive themselves, for example. And as we've heard from other people, the older you are, the harder it can be to get your birth certificate if you don't have a copy of it, and you're more likely to have lost your birth certificate through a long life. We see no compelling reason to make these changes. I urge you to vote inexpedient to legislate, and I will be submitting written testimony with more details.
Thank you for hearing me today. I recently participated in the testing for the new voter registration system. And the one thing that they said over and over again is you do not want to disenfranchise your voter, and that's why we put these pieces into the new system. Our current EPM says specifically, do not send a voter home or anywhere to get information, because right now you can take care of them with an affidavit at the polls. So HB 1569 will definitely disenfranchise voters. There's been a lot of talk about the different voters, so I'm not going to repeat it, but I do want to talk about students, because every time we get a student come to register, we cheer, because it is so great for our students to get there and come and vote. This is definitely going to disenfranchise them because most of them do not have proof of citizenship when they show up. And just for numbers, in our last presidential primary, we had 189 new voters, of which 44, did fill out an affidavit, and most of them were for citizenship. Only 2 were for identity, and 2 were for domicile. So people take a lot of effort to come and vote, and I would not have to want to turn them away. And as a supervisor, I'm concerned because our polls in Pembroke are very peaceful. We really have no confrontation, and I like it that way. I feel safe that way. This bill is going to threaten that. We are going to have confrontation. We are going to have angry people, people storming out. I may not feel safe there. I may not want to do my job anymore. If voter fraud were a big issue, I could definitely see this, but we're hearing it's not a big issue. We're hearing the numbers are not a big issue. So I don't think it's necessary. And I just want to mention one more thing. My role as AARP, one of my roles, I'm a fraud fighter. And fraud is more prolific, well, I'm just going to say, than dandelions on my lawn in the spring. If you do this to stop fraud, before this bill even goes in, the people who want to defraud the system will have another way around it. So I definitely oppose this bill, and I thank you for your time.
Questions from the senators? Seeing none, thank you very much. Autumn Rasnick. And it looks like it's got Goodwin at the end.
Thank you very much. For the record, my name is Autumn Rashid Goodwin. I am the program coordinator from Open Democracy Action, a nonpartisan nonprofit organization here in Concord that focuses on voter rights and campaign finance reform, among other issues. Today, I'm going to be presenting testimony on behalf of some of our members and one of my coworkers. I'm going to keep it brief.
If you've got written testimony from other people, hand it in. And you can speak to it, but you cannot read it, okay?
Okay.
So do it as a summary, because...
Yep, it was just a couple of quotes I wanted to highlight. Primarily, I wanted to highlight a couple of the stories that were presented. One being in divorced families. A lot of children of divorce will be splitting their time between two different domiciles. So they don't necessarily know which is the correct domicile to list and to bring documentation for on registration day. So they could be presenting the wrong information and not be able to register if they're not able to do an affidavit with that. Additionally, I wanted to present an individual who lost their documentation due to a house fire. And because of not having any of the backup documentation, we're going through constant loops of not having the identification needed in order to get their documentation replaced. So it took them several months to accomplish that. Without the affidavit system that currently exists, they wouldn't have been able to vote in that election. Beyond that, I will hand in the written testimony so you can read further details.
Yep.
Had a little too much coffee, my hands are shaky.
Any questions from senators? Okay, thank you. Matt Munson? There a Matt out there?
He might be out there.
It looks like M-O-S-I-N-A-N.
Busy day. Sorry, I was up in the hall.
Okay.
Morning, Chairman Gray, and members of the Municipal Affairs and Election Law Committee. My name's Matt Mushian. I live in Claremont, and I serve as the Advocacy and Engagement Director for 603 Forward, a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization dedicated to educating, activating, and empowering young people in New Hampshire. I'm here today to testify in opposition to House Bill 1569. We've seen numerous studies, reports, and investigations in the recent years that have all confirmed that New Hampshire elections are safe and secure and that our existing affidavit system works. Just recently, the day before the House voted on House Bill 1569, when asked about the bill by WMUR, Governor Sununu suggested he did not think the bill was necessary, saying, quote, "Our system works very well, so I'm not looking to make any changes," end quote. 603 Forward opposes this legislation because it will disproportionately and negatively impact the right to vote for young Granite Staters, which is why we urge the committee to vote inexpedient to legislate on House Bill 1569. Young professionals who are moving here for new jobs, students who want to enroll in one of our great schools, or a new American who has fled political violence or persecution and is coming here who may be excited for the first time to take part in our proud tradition of free and fair elections could uniquely and negatively be impacted by this bill for the simple fact that they are less likely to have easy access to physical copies of these required documents. When I was a student at New England College, like most students, I didn't carry an original copy of my birth certificate or social security card on campus. And even recently, I just turned 30 and my birth certificate and other important documents are still in the safe at my parents' house about 20 minutes from me. I wouldn't have been able to register to vote when I was 18 under the provisions of House Bill 1569. And moreover, if I find myself removed from the voter roll, if I move and need to re-register or fall into another circumstance in the future, I'll face additional hurdles when registering and potentially be unable to vote for the first time in my life. And this is a reality that many young Granite Staters could face. In conclusion, as a former city councilor and election worker, I've seen firsthand how common it can be for someone to forget or not have the proper proof, but I've also seen how hard our election officials work to keep our elections safe and secure. There are legitimate concerns to House Bill 1569 and the impact it will have on Granite Staters and their constitutional right to vote, and this committee should listen to them and take heed. If we're serious about preventing voter fraud and ensuring the integrity of our elections, we should look into policies like online voter registration or becoming a member state of the Electronic Registration Information Center to make our focus on making our elections more secure while maintaining efficiency for people to participate in the bedrock of our democracy, which are free and fair elections. So I would ask that you please vote in expedient to legislate on House Bill 1569. Thank you.
Questions from the senators? Seeing none, thank you very much. Warner D, looks like maybe Horn.
Good morning, Senator. For the record, my name is Werner Horn. I am a supervisor of the checklist for Franklin's Ward 2, and I'm here to bring some data. You mentioned earlier you're an engineer, so here are some numbers. Franklin's Ward 2 is approximately 2,700 people. Only about 1,100 of those are actually on the voter roll. In the state primary, where we had high numbers for turnout across the state, I handled 70 voter affidavits on same-day registration. That's 6% of my total voter roll. That's in Franklin enough to move a candidate to win 70 people. And when we've heard conversations earlier that one or two people get prosecuted, that certainly tells me that this process of voter affidavits helps way more than it hinders.
Additional comments? No? Questions from the senators? Seeing none, thank you very much. Curtis, I'm going to guess Register.
Yes, Senator. Curtis Register.
All right.
I have a letter. Do you want me? Yep.
He'll take it.
Okay, here you go. Thank you. I will not be reading the letter.
Good. Paraphrase is always
Yes, indeed,
best.
sir. Good morning, y'all. Honorable Senators of the Municipal Affairs and Election Law Committee. My name is Curtis Register. I'm a United States Marine Corps veteran. I'm a resident of the town of Durham, and I'm also a town councilor for the town of Durham, though today I am speaking as a resident. I've distributed a letter co-signed by myself and several other veterans here in opposition of HB 1569. This bill, like its predecessor from last session, HB 460, which I spoke out against then, is a bill in search of a problem that will disenfranchise and prevent eligible voters from executing their right to vote. Secretary of State Scanlon has already performed a thorough and comprehensive investigation into the New Hampshire voting process and found it to be both safe and secure and effective. In his report, Secretary Scanlon and his committee made several recommendations to shore up vulnerabilities in our process. Removing the affidavit process was not one of those recommendations. The leading candidate in every election amongst eligible voters is did not vote. Democracy requires citizens' voices be heard, and obstacles to those voices, like HB 1569, without any evidence-based reasoning, are contrary to democratic ideals. The affidavit process has proven to be effective. Don't infringe the right to vote. It is sacred and essential. Please vote down HB 1569.
Questions from committee members? Seeing none, thank you. Oh,
thank you, Representative.
We do have one.
Sorry, late question for you, Counselor.
Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned you were a veteran, and I agree with everything you said. Did you want to make any particular points about sort of how this bill would impact those that are either in active service or perhaps even children of military families was another topic that was brought up?
Certainly. So for active military personnel, we move a lot. There are a lot of situations where our documents don't reach the same destination as the person. There are also plenty of times where we don't have a lot of time to go and go to the DMV and get registered because the op tempo is so high. And of course, obviously, when you have a voting day itself, it is not always on the most convenient and low density day. Additionally, for our veterans, there are tons of obligations as soon as you transition that require your time and attention that are, to be blunt, very challenging to deal with. And finding your documentation when you've already served your country and you've already earned your right to vote legally by all other means, but to have an additional obstacle put in your place that has precluded you from doing it on the same day is an unnecessary step. Does that answer your question?
It does, sir. Thank you.
Seeing no other questions, thank you very much.
Thank you for your time.
Representative Potenza.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Chairman. Just for the record, my name is Representative Kelly Potenza, Stratford District 19, Rochester Wards 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6. I strongly support this bill for a number of different reasons. I have been involved in, it's part of the reason why I ran for office in election integrity efforts across the state since 2016. And I could be here for a long time, and I won't be because you have a lot of other people to hear from in regards with why this is so important. I am going to send you this in an email as well because I just think it's critical. So countries where an ID is required to vote, and I'm just going to give you 10: Iceland, Sweden, New Zealand, Denmark, Canada, Ireland, Switzerland, Finland, Australia, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Germany, Austria, United Kingdom, Spain, on and on and on. And we make this so difficult, and I don't understand why it is. I really can't stand people calling something an affidavit. An affidavit is a legal document which you actually have to show an ID and swear an oath to a correct officer to do so. We are not doing that. They're filling out a piece of paper that doesn't even get sometimes followed up on in a timely fashion is not an affidavit. Calling something something doesn't make it something. So I just want to be clear about that. I also want to be clear that there was a representative, her name is Ann Kopp. She was in Derry. And so this was actually in the 2020 election in regards with everyone that came in and signed an affidavit saying that they were legally allowed to vote in Derry. She was in Derry at the time. And those were not followed up on by the Secretary of State. And once they were, it was ridiculous how many came back. Over a third of those came back undeliverable. They couldn't even find most of those people. There was an apartment complex that didn't have apartment numbers. They just had, 10 Smith Street. And I'm going to speak to what I know exactly what happened recently. So this is in Durham. This is at the First in the Nation primary. So this was just recently in January. We had a gentleman there that was a poll challenger that was trained. I helped train him. He went there and watched folks you can come and vote in New Hampshire via vouching for someone with an out of date, expired college ID. That stuff it's not about, if you want to vote, you should have those documents. There's a lot of the people here that are talking about, oh, well, you wouldn't have that. How are you here? You're not in school as a student. You're not here as a resident. You can't do anything without having an ID in New Hampshire. And this is the kind of stuff that is just a lot of misinformation. No one's talking about fraud. We're talking about the legal right to vote. And it's all constitutional. And we're so far down, we've gone so far away to something that's so simple. So during my election in 22, I knocked on over 3,000 doors and spoke to voters on all sides. This is not a partisan issue. It's a simple issue. I talked to a very strong Democrat that was a Vietnam veteran, and when I told him that, yes, you don't have to have an ID to vote in New Hampshire, he was angry. He's followed up with me. I actually earned his vote, even though we're probably on the opposite sides of every other issue. People don't realize how lackadaisical it is here in New Hampshire. It's very simple. If we're going to have real affidavits, let's go for it. Let's have them be real, legal documents. Because right now, I'm going to be able to provide a lot of information to this committee about those 90-day followed up on you don't have an ID type of thing. And just so you know, in Durham, there was not one voter challenged affidavit put in. But there were a lot of people that voted without an ID because they were either vouched for or they had an expired college ID. This bill needs to happen. And that's all I have to say about that.
Questions from the senators? Seeing none, thank you very much. Al?
Could I? Thank you, Senator Gray. My name is Al Brandino. I'm from Kensington, New Hampshire. And I'm asking you to support HB 1569. This bill corrects the unlawful use of the affidavit process, and I'll submit as supported by recent court decisions. Second, unconstitutional actions that create unequal and separate class of voters. 3, it rebuilds and supports the election security and voter confidence in reference to Secretary Scanlon's 2022 voter confidence hearings. This bill corrects, 1, the affidavit process. Affidavit by Black's Law Dictionary, an affidavit definition and legal meaning. A written or printed declaration or statement of facts made voluntarily and confirmed by the oath of an affirmant of the party making it, taking before an officer having authority to administer such oaths. That means presence. Somebody has to be present. The person who can swear an oath has to be present for the person to be able to be, the affidavit to be legal. That's not happening. Currently, the unlawful affidavit process, in this case, oath of office or administration, is not taken before an officer having authority to administer an oath. With no accepted voting identification as provided by New Hampshire law, one cannot confirm one is who they are, nor can the authority sign, seal with approval. And I'll reference New Hampshire Constitution, Part 2, Article 30. Describes as an inhabitant as a person qualified as the Constitution provides. On April 11th, 2024, Boise, Idaho, in a 5-0 decision, the Idaho Supreme Court upheld Idaho's voter ID law and affirmed in full the district's court decision from last October in Babe Vote and the League of Women Voters of Ohio versus Phil Maguire. Idaho challenged the law, states that the student identification cards are not valid identification when it comes to registering to vote, citing a lack of uniformity and sophistication. This is a strong victory for election security and the minimum standards that must be met in order to vote, said Attorney General Labrador. The new laws are rationally related to the stated purpose to clarify and create uniformity by requiring only general accepted, authentic, and reliable forms of identification as reasonable conditions to exercise the right of suffrage. This bill corrects, number 2, the unconstitutional and repugnant practice of violating separate but equal clause, as well as creating a second-class voter under the New Hampshire Constitution, Part 1, Article 11 and 12. For example, one who requires a lawful accepted ID at the polling location and then makes an exception for a small amount of voters who do not provide a lawful ID for domicile, age, or citizenship, but is still allowed to vote in person or by mail. And finally, this bill supports and continues the efforts of the New Hampshire Secretary of State's Voter Confidence Committee report of 2022 to rebuild New Hampshire citizens' faith, trust, and enhance security in the voting process. Please, I ask you to support this bill 1569.
Questions from the senators? Seeing none, thank you very much.
Senator, may I have a point of personal privilege?
If it relates directly to the bill,
It relates to this hearing.
does it relate to the bill?
Yes.
I will stop you
You can stop me if you wish, but let me ask you, I look around the room, there's not many citizens like me who are here, and I understand why they can't come because we work. Would it be something to suggest in the future that you allow citizens to speak before lobbyists? They're being paid and they have their time. We have to go back to work. If you could consider that, sir, I'd appreciate it.
Thank you. Mackenzie St. Germain.
Good morning. It's still morning. My name is Mackenzie St. Germain. I live in Manchester and am with New Hampshire Campaign for Voting Rights and America Votes New Hampshire. We are here today in opposition of this bill. I'd like to emphasize at the top that although we're talking about many specific stories and specific groups of people, this bill could absolutely affect any single person at any time when registering because they don't have documents. I also want to emphasize that because of a bill that was passed by the legislature in 2022, voters, when they are registering to vote for the first time, must provide ID. So when we're talking about voter ID laws and requirements, those folks need to provide ID, and I provide it within 7 days if they don't have it on election day for their vote to count. Finally, on the kind of top points here, the Committee on Voter Confidence made a number of recommendations. None of those included additional proofs of ID or citizenship or domicile for voters. A lot of those recommendations were connected to greater access, greater training for election officials, but making it more difficult to register to vote was not within that list and the work of that committee. There are many issues in the bill that have talked about today. I want to emphasize again that although someone could be without proof of domicile, proof of age, especially proof of citizenship, is an unprecedented burden and is not in place in the way it is documentary proof of citizenship anywhere else in the country. These are not documents that you could go get within a day or 7 days, often depending on where you were born, your personal circumstances. This could be weeks, months. It is not easy to move someplace, decide you're going to vote, or decide a week before the election, as we want people to do in New Hampshire, cast their ballot and make their voice heard. If they don't have a proof of citizenship, if they don't have a passport or birth certificate, they're not going to be able to turn around that document in time. I am going to share testimony here from Alex Tashenko. He is with the Institute for Responsive Government Action.
Paraphrase it. Don't read it.
I'm not going to read it. Alex served in the Department of Justice under both the Trump and Obama administrations, including enforcing the National Voter Registration Act. So you can see in here his analysis of the bill, both on the legal precedent of proof of citizenship, the burden that creates, as well as around the National Voter Registration Act having no longer potentially under this bill, as someone who worked in the DOJ, understanding that every voter would not be able to register on election day because every voter does not have access to citizenship documents. That would result in us, again, as has been mentioned before, losing that NVRA exemption required to implement voter in the number of things that come along with that, including third-party voter registration at a cost of millions of dollars per year to maintain that. So I will share this and encourage folks to read it, and encourage folks, if they have questions, Alex is happy to talk more about his analysis, and I will take any questions if there are any.
Questions from senators? Seeing none, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Dan Healy?
Hi, Dan Healy, representing New Hampshire City and Town Clerks Association, where I am the current president. I'm not going to go over everything that everyone discussed earlier. I was watching from the lobby all the points against this bill. That's how our association feels. We don't see the need of removing the affidavit. I did want to address one thing that a previous speaker mentioned regarding addresses being incorrect. I was a Derrytown clerk in 2020. Miss Kopp is not a credible, reliable source of information.
Stop.
We had
Stop. You testify on your own, don't
I'm
cast aspersions on anyone else.
okay. So this relates to the affidavits being used, the addresses, where a previous speaker is saying that the addresses were not correct. Interactions with Ms. Kopp, we had asked for.
I asked you not to speak about anyone else. I told you to speak for your own.
I'm just trying to
We're
verify
talking to
that
the
this relates to the bill.
Again, don't mention anyone else. You understand?
Okay.
Other than that, you're going to be asked to leave.
Okay, it does relate to the bill. So just in general, when I'll rephrase this, in general,
When a person,
when a voter comes in with a concern on an address, we ask to look at the documents that they have to then verify on our own. So if someone comes in and says, I have 400 addresses that, I mailed stuff out and it came back, we would then look to see those documents to verify it. So to speak on, that's the process that we have in place, that we would verify the addresses. So if someone says they're not correct, we would look and check on those. So not going into too much detail. One of the concerns that I do have with this bill, I brought up last week on a different hearing. It's the same kind of concern relating to if the election official receiving the application confirms through the centralized voter registration database. Not all our polling locations, none of our polling locations, we have a laptop there to look at the centralized voter registration database. So we would not be able to do that at our polling locations. And it's not just on having the laptop present, it's having the people there with the access to actually look up the voter registration database. So that would be an issue in larger communities. In Derry, they do have a laptop there. In Nashua with the wards, we don't have a way to look up the voter database. Another concern that I had, a person aggrieved by the decision of said official may take immediate appeal to the Superior Court. How late is the Superior Court open? They're going to go over to the Superior Court. I don't think they're going to be heard right away on their appeal, and they're going to lose their right to vote on that day. There's no process really outlined in this section for how that appeal would really work. So not going into all the other concerns that everyone else already mentioned over the last few hours, we are opposed for these reasons and the previous reasons.
questions from the senators? Thank you very much. Olivia Zinc.
Olivia Zinc, a voter in Franklin and executive director of Open Democracy. I want to speak about the impact of this legislation to our cherished election workers. The bill takes effect 60 days under passage. I think there's a very good chance that this bill does not get signed before July 10th. Therefore, we will have one set of rules for the September 10th primary and a different set of rules for the general election. Will that mean that there are two sets of trainings for election workers to go through for both different elections? Will that mean that there are two different election procedure manuals issued? I think that we really need to honor our election workers that are implementing our laws. They're doing their best to have safe and secure elections in New Hampshire. They are elected supervisors of the checklist. They're sworn for people to fill out these affidavits, and they say the process works. Don't change it so close to an election. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Questions from the senators? Seeing none. Lisa Bowden.
Coming up on lunch, I think we're all probably getting hungry. For the record, my name is Lisa Bodwin. I am not a lobbyist. I am a citizen, and I run strategies for disability equity. I'm here to discuss the critical implications of eliminating voter affidavits. specifically the impact on individuals with disabilities, ability to access New Hampshire's electoral process. As a policy analyst, I offer these insights on why you should vote ITL on HB 1569. The act of voting is the heart of New Hampshire's live free or die democratic ethos. It symbolizes equal participation for all citizens to shape the future of our beautiful granite state. However, exercising this constitutional right for individuals with disabilities, and in particular individuals with the label of intellectual or developmental disability, often means facing formidable physical and bureaucratic barriers. These barriers undermine the principle of universal suffrage, necessitating proactive measures to ensure inclusivity for voters with disabilities. Voter affidavits are one such proactive measure to mitigate the barriers faced by the disability community. They provide a means for individuals facing challenges in acquiring traditional forms of identification to assert their eligibility to vote without undue barriers. A few of these challenges are issues like mobility types, financial constraints, or the bureaucratic complexities of registering. Affidavits are a mechanism in alignment with the provisions on accessibility, inclusivity, and reasonable accommodations contained in the Americans with Disabilities Act. Eliminating voter affidavits risks exacerbating the disenfranchisement of individuals with disabilities, which New Hampshire must safeguard in order to safeguard their civil liberties. There is a terrible cycle of disenfranchisement. It includes the negative social perceptions of people with disabilities, so their needs for voter participation are often ignored or poorly understood. Oftentimes, people with the label of intellectual or developmental disability don't have access to lease agreements or utility payment forms. They have frequently absentee public guardians who barely get to their annual meetings, let alone answer any questions about voter participation. Family members are exhausted for a whole host of reasons, including that there is a severe workforce shortage, and when you can finally get someone to work for you, they're often undertrained, and voter participation is not on their list because it's usually not part of a service agreement. And the cycle goes on and on. Voter affidavits offer a vital recourse for people with disabilities who encounter discriminatory practices and administrative hurdles at the actual polls. Affidavits hold up the tenets of fairness enshrined in New Hampshire's preeminent history of commitment to liberty for people with disabilities. Remember, in 1991, we were the first state in our nation to close institutions. I urge this committee not to ignore the consequences of how HB 1569 will both negatively impact and disproportionately impact the disability community. Upholding the integrity of our electoral process necessitates a commitment to accessibility and inclusivity, principles that transcend partisan divides and embody the essence of our democratic republic. Please vote ITL on 1569.
Questions from senators? Seeing none, thank you very much. I got a Michael Horn, did not indicate whether, and applause is unacceptable. Is there a mic check, see if there's anybody outside? While we're waiting for him, there's Liz Wester.
Hi, Senators. My name is Liz Wester. I'm on the Board of Registrars in Manchester and serve as an Election Day Registrar in Manchester as well. I'm here to talk about my personal experience in having voters register to vote on Election Day. Especially this past presidential primary was a very busy Election Day in Manchester, and we had a number of voters come in with all the paperwork that they could possibly gather and still needed to use voter affidavits to make sure they could cast their ballot on Election Day. we had seniors who had recently moved into an apartment, who had not yet updated their license, who needed to use a voter affidavit. We had citizens who were not born in this country, who got all the documents together that they possibly could, and still needed to use the citizen affidavit. I would say that more than half of the voters that were registering on that day had to use some sort of affidavit to be able to cast their ballot. And included in that process is reading a statement that they are swearing to what the information is on the affidavit is true. Myself and the other registrars do everything possible to make sure that folks are able to cast their ballot on election day. I'm also going to submit into the record a letter from 48 other election officials who encourage you to ITL 1569 and help to keep our voting process as it is. And I'll take any questions if there are any.
Questions, Senator?
A quick one. Could you just speak to the issue of the time it took for those folks that you described to register and what impact this legislation would potentially have on further waiting?
Yeah, I would say that if someone is coming in, it probably takes 10 to 15 minutes for them to fill out all the forms. If they're filling out additional affidavits, it generally takes them a few minutes to fill it out and then a few minutes to go through all the information together. We make sure that all the information is filled out and make sure they really understand what they are signing to, as well as have them repeat back a sworn oath. If they are, not able to register, we're really digging deeper to make sure that they do not have access to those documents. It could potentially take up to 30 minutes to talk to them about that, especially if they are potentially trying to leave the polling location and then come back later in the day. That's a much longer process for both us as election officials and for the voter. Thank you.
Okay. Apparently there's no one left outside. That is everyone who has signed up and checked the box that they wanted to speak. In addition, there was 110 people who support the bill online, and there was 433 who opposed the bill online. And with that, we will close the public hearing, and as soon as we're ready, we'll start the last one for the day. I don't think the next one's going to take long. Yeah, and I've got leadership at noon, so. Yeah. I don't think that we're going to be several of us have commitments. And
So you want me to schedule? Okay. Will Jeff get
okay, representative. When you're ready, Rep.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know it's been a long morning for you, and I will try and keep this brief. I am State Representative Angela Brennan from Bow, representing Merrimack District 9, Bow and Hopkinton. And today I am here to introduce HB 1596, a bipartisan bill to begin to address the use of artificial intelligence as it relates to elections. This bill passed the House in a very loud bipartisan voice vote and is enthusiastically supported by the Secretary of State. 2024 is the first election year where artificial intelligence is at everyone's fingertips. Indeed, what once cost thousands of dollars can now be done in a couple of minutes using a phone app for next to nothing. In fact, we saw this take place during our First in the Nation primary when an audio recording sounding a lot like President Biden encouraged voters not to participate in our primary. Deceptive synthetic media manipulates images, audio, and video to trick the viewer or listener and depict something that did not actually occur in real life. In an age of rapidly advancing technology and an ever increasing rise in disinformation, the 2024 election is a perfect storm ripe for dirty tricks. Let me state emphatically, the dissemination of disinformation is detrimental to our democracy, and we must do something about it. HB 1596 requires disclosure of deceptively manipulated media, often referred to as fraudulent deepfakes. The definitions that you see in this bill are consistent with other AI bills that the House has sent over to the Senate. We have made sure that that consistency exists. This bill is the only bill that can go into effect this year. Other bills that you may see before you at other times in other committees would establish criminal penalties, specific criminal penalties, requiring that those bills would not be able to be into effect until January 2025, which we know would be after our critical presidential election year. So this bill requires disclosure. The instance here is that if the deepfake does not have disclosure, it would be prohibited within 90 days of an election, within 90 days of a candidate appearing on the ballot. This limited time frame exists as one of several ways this bill bends over backwards to ameliorate any First Amendment concerns. And the disclosure must appear or be heard easily by the average viewer or listener. For a video, the disclosure must be present for the duration of the video. For an audio recording, the disclosure must be at the beginning and at the end of the audio, as well as interspersed within any audio greater than 2 minutes in length. This bill allows a candidate to take action if they are depicted in an undisclosed deepfake. The candidate may seek injunctive relief to stop the distribution of the deceptive deepfake, as well as bring an action for damages against the sponsor. This bill does not prescribe to the courts what action they should take. In fact, it is for that reason that this bill can go into effect this year. It would be up to the courts to determine what is the appropriate action and punishment for such deception. There are a number of First Amendment safe harbors in this bill that provide exemptions for news broadcasts, publications, radio and TV stations that make a reasonable effort to prevent spreading deepfakes, as well as an exemption for obvious satire or parody. The aim of this bill is to hold the sponsor of the fraudulent deepfakes accountable, not good faith distributors. HB 1596 is a necessary, bipartisan, common sense, forward-thinking bill that takes a step forward to deal with the reality of the rapidly advancing technology capable of disrupting our democracy and deceptively sowing distrust. Voters deserve better than deception and dirty tricks. This bill is a tool in the toolbox that we need to have in place for the 2024 election, and I would hope that, like the House, we could see strong bipartisan support for it. Thank you, and I would be happy to take any questions.
Questions from the senators? Seeing none, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Representative McGee?
Thank you, Senator Gray. Nice to see you again. And thank you for having me here this morning. It's nice to be here with election law and municipal affairs. I'm a co-sponsor on the bill. When I heard about it, I thought it made a lot of sense for us to try and pull something together before this election, because we can anticipate that we will be seeing this in our state as it's been arising across the country. So my name is Kat McGee, and I'm a representative for Hillsborough 35, which is Hollis. And I serve on the House Science, Technology, and Energy Committee. So we're here today to talk about deception versus honesty. There's an old saying that a lie can get around the world before the truth can put its boots on. Once a lie is released, people will believe it, even if the truth comes out. As a society, we've been pretty lenient with lies. It's not illegal to lie, even as a public official in a position of trust. Trust itself gets eroded when the whole system of democracy and the whole system of democracy is weakened. I'm sure many of us remember Superman's motto: truth, justice, and the American way. Truth is primary. Truth is pivotal. It's essential to a democracy. In an age of artificial intelligence, lawmakers have to figure out how to keep up with laws that protect citizens from predatory and unfair practices. In some cases, people will lose money. In other cases, they will be deceived for profit by others. HB 1596 doesn't seek to prevent deep fakes. It seeks to give New Hampshire some guardrails that say that creators must label their deceptive content as fakery so that the people of New Hampshire are not manipulated or deceived to their own detriment. In an age of deep fakes, where we can make politicians say things they never said, or convince people something has happened that has never happened, we need to remember that all the old euphemisms are still true as well. Seeing is believing. Lawmakers are responsible for ensuring that fakery isn't embraced at this point in time for this upcoming election. So we are not the reason that the public loses additional trust. There is no First Amendment issue with this legislation. You can still put out deceptive materials. You just can't do so without labeling it so that the viewer can have some way of knowing the information is contrived and not actual footage of a real person or event. Think of your loved ones. Think of what a crucial time it is in our history with technology and artificial intelligence. The bill is simple and elegant. I ask that you vote HB 1596 ought to pass so that the people of New Hampshire are not being deceived with our complicity. It does not take much imagination to see what harm it will do to have computers turning out a fake reality. We have the chance to make it illegal to put up fake content without labeling it, and we will protect impressionable voters from a preventable scam. If we truly want election integrity, then we want voters to have access to good information. If we also have to accept not so good information in the mix, let's require it be labeled for consumers' protection. I ask that we exercise our powers as lawmakers to make sure that people can continue to believe their eyes. Thank you.
Questions from the senators? Seeing none, thank you. Is there anybody else out there? Representative Barry said he wanted to speak. Okay. Let's just check, just to make sure if there's Linda Bundy.
Thank you, Chairman Gray and members of Senate Election Law and Municipal Affairs. I'm Linda Bundy. I live in Antrim. I support HB 1596. Examples of artificial intelligence, or AI, frequently are in the news, demonstrating both positive and negative applications. Political advertising is an area that can invite misuse. HB 1596 requires disclosure of deceptive AI in political advertising within 90 days of a candidate's appearance on the ballot. Just last week, Secretary of State Scanlon testified in Washington, D.C., before the Senate Judiciary Committee's Subcommittee on Privacy, Technology, and the Law. He referenced the AI-generated robocall that imitated President Biden during our presidential primary. He also spoke about HB 1596 and the importance of not allowing, quote, malicious and illegal attempts to suppress the vote or manipulate the outcome of an election, end quote. This bill addresses First Amendment safeguards such as allowances for parody and satire. It is bipartisan, common sense, and if passed, will go into effect before the November 2024 election. I ask that you vote ought to pass on this bill.
Questions from senators? Seeing none, thank you very much. Just a note, apparently Representative Barry isn't here. He did sign in support. Liz Tentarelli.
Thank you, Senator. Liz Tentarelli, resident of Newbury, president of the League of Women Voters of New Hampshire. We support this bill. We believe it is necessary, but I come mostly to inform you that the League of Women Voters New Hampshire and our national organization and 5 New Hampshire residents have brought suit against the companies behind the robocall that was initiated in New Hampshire in January. And so that we don't have a trial date yet, but we are suing because obviously we believe this is the wrong way for people to try to get messages out about elections. We don't want to have to bring suit over every instance. The state certainly doesn't want to do that, nor do candidates. So I think we need something in statute, and this is a good bill to do that. So thank you for letting me tell you about that.
Questions from the senators? Seeing none, thank you very much. Deputy?
Almost good afternoon, Senators. Good to see you again. Erin Hennessy, Deputy Secretary of State. We are in support of this legislation. As another speaker noted, Secretary Scanlon went down to DC recently to speak on the importance of this. One thing that we would like to ask that the committee include would be to also include, in addition to candidates, New Hampshire election officials, because if something were to come out that was false or misleading about our election, being stated by one of our New Hampshire election officials, either on the state level or local level, that can have devastating effects to one of our elections. For example, if a well-known city clerk were to come out and somebody were to alter something to say that the polling locations have changed or the hours have changed to suppress the vote of that city, that would have a devastating effect on our New Hampshire elections. I think that if you search candidates mentioned 3 times, I may be misspoken, but that's what we would like to see added to this legislation. Otherwise, we fully support it.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Questions from the senators? Seeing none. Mr. Burnett?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, members of the committee. Jamie Burnett, Sightline Public Affairs, here representing Google. And I'd just say that I think the deputy's comments on that make a lot of sense. We agree with the intent of this bill. We think it's well written. There is one issue that we have with the bill that we would ask that the committee might consider in amending, and that appears on page 2 in Roman paragraph 5. Under the exemptions section of the bill. On line 21, letter A, it looks to exempt interactive computer services, which we appreciate. The qualifying language that appears after the words section 230, though, we believe would unintentionally continue to cover interactive computer services if the technology that's made available by those companies were used to create content that would be prohibited under the bill, even if the interactive computer service has no knowledge of that or is aware of that. So an example would be if I were to use, say, Google's Gemini AI tool to create prohibited content, and then I distribute it as an individual online against the provisions of this bill. The intent is that Google would be exempted under this, but the concern is that because I use their platform to create the content, that they would be liable, and that the exemption that you have in here would actually, the protection would be nullified. This has happened in other states. Other states have recognized this and begun to clarify that language, also to try to make it more consistent with federal law. The easiest option in terms of addressing that issue.
I'm going to let you work with Representative Brennan.
Yeah.
And the
Happy
two of
to.
you can
Yep.
send me an email.
You bet.
Of what you want, and we'll present that.
Okay, great. Thanks. Do you have any, with that, I will do that. I will save you the rest of your time and get you to lunch, but any questions that I can answer for you?
Questions from the senators? Seeing none, thank you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate your time.
And let the record show that Representative Brennan shook her head yes. So, all right. Anyone else? Okay, 22 online support, come up.
Thank you. For the record, my name is Autumn Rashid Goodwin, a voter from Manchester and the program coordinator for Open Democracy Action, a nonpartisan nonprofit representing 36,000 voters in New Hampshire. I'm submitting testimony in favor of HB 1596. I'll just be quick so that you guys can get to lunch because I know we are way over. I really wanted to highlight how easy it is to spread fraudulent information with the advancement of technologies in current days, and how vital it is for us to have laws in place to protect particularly our public-facing members of society, like our political candidates. Because with each appearance that they make, each recording of them, it makes it easier and easier to make a virtual duplicate of them. And you can make it say whatever you want because there are additional data points to make it even more accurate. This isn't a far off issue, and as previous testifiers have spoken to, even Secretary Scanlon is concerned about the ease at which a member of the public can create one of these deep fakes with little to no experience in AI creation. Over the time, the creation of deep fakes went from costing an exorbitant amount of time and money to being something that can be achieved with relative ease using readily available software that's available for public purchase. So I hope that the committee supports HB 1596 with a vote of ought to pass.
Okay, thank you. Questions from senators? Seeing none. As I was saying, 22 online support, 9 opposed. Anyone else? Seeing none. We'll close the public hearing, and due to the lateness, we won't have an executive session today. And with that, we'll adjourn the committee meeting.